In this video, we dive into 3 of Agatha Christie's most cunning tales, where secrets, lies, and danger lurk at every corner. First, step into the double clue, where a seemingly harmless murder unravels a chilling plot of deception, leading to a shocking twist you won't see coming. Then, in the Submarine plans, a seemingly innocent spy game takes a deadly turn, with stolen secrets that could change the course of history, and a killer in the shadows ready to strike. Finally, Ingots of Gold introduces you to a complex web of greed, betrayal, and mistaken identity, where hidden treasures lead to unexpected deaths and betrayals. These stories are packed with mind-bending puzzles, mysterious deaths, and a cast of characters that could be hiding deadly secrets. Brace yourself for a suspense-filled journey where nothing is ever quite as it seems.
Agatha Christie, Ingots of Gold. I do not know that the story that I'm going to tell you is a fair one, said Raymond West, because I can't give you the solution of it. Yet the facts were so interesting and so curious that I should like to propound it to you as a problem, and perhaps between us we may arrive at some logical conclusion. The date of these happenings was 2 years ago, when I went down to spend Whitsuntide with a man called John Newman in Cornwall. Cornwall? Said Joyce Lemprero sharply. Yes. Why? Nothing. Only it's odd. My story is about a place in Cornwall, too, a little fishing village called Rathole. Don't tell me yours is the same. No. My village is called Polperron. It is situated on the west coast of Cornwall, a very wild and rocky spot. I had been introduced to John a few weeks previously, and had found him a most interesting companion. A man of intelligence and independent means, he was possessed of a romantic imagination. As a result of his latest hobby, he had taken the lease of Pol House. He was an authority on Elizabethan times, and he described to me in vivid and graphic language the rout of the Spanish Armada. So enthusiastic was he that one could almost imagine that he had been an eyewitness at the scene. Is there anything in reincarnation? I wonder. I very much wonder. You are so romantic, Raymond dear, said Miss Marple, looking benignantly at him. Romantic is the last thing that I am, said Raymond West, slightly annoyed. But this fellow Newman was chock full of it, and he interested me for that reason as a curious survival of the past. It appears that a certain ship belonging to the Armada, and known to contain a vast amount of treasure in the form of gold from the Spanish Main, was wrecked off the coast of Cornwall on the famous and treacherous Serpent Rocks. For some years, so Newman told me, attempts had been made to salvage the ship and recover the treasure. I believe such stories are not uncommon, though the number of mythical treasure ships is largely in excess of the genuine ones. A company had been formed, but had gone bankrupt, and Newman had been able to buy the rights of the thing, or whatever you call it, for a mere song. He waxed very enthusiastic about it all. According to him, it was merely a question of the latest scientific up-to-date machinery. The gold was there, and he had no doubt whatever that it could be recovered. It occurred to me as I listened to him how often things happen that way. A rich man such as Newman succeeds almost without effort, and yet in all probability the actual value in money of his find would mean little to him. I must say that his ardour infected me. I saw galleons drifting up the coast, flying before the storm, beaten and broken on the black rocks. The mere word galleon has a romantic sound. The phrase Spanish gold thrills the schoolboy, and the grown-up man also. Moreover, I was working at the time upon a novel, some scenes of which were laid in the 16th century, and I saw the prospect of getting valuable local colour from my host. I set off that Friday morning from Paddington in high spirits, and looking forward to my trip. The carriage was empty except for one man who sat facing me in the opposite corner. He was a tall, soldierly-looking man, and I could not rid myself of the impression that somewhere or other I had seen him before. I cudgelled my brains for some time in vain, but at last I had it. My travelling companion was Inspector Badgeworth, and I had run across him when I was doing a series of articles on the Everson disappearance case. I recalled myself to his notice, and we were soon chatting pleasantly enough. When I told him I was going to Polperron, he remarked that that was a rum coincidence, because he himself was also bound for that place. I did not like to seem inquisitive, so was careful not to ask him what took him there. Instead, I spoke of my own interest in the place, and mentioned the wrecked Spanish galleon. To my surprise, the inspector seemed to know all about it. "That will be the Juan Fernandez," he said. "Your friend won't be the first who has sunk money trying to get money out of her. It is a romantic notion." "And probably the whole story is a myth," I said. "No ship was ever wrecked there at all." "Oh, the ship was sunk there right enough," said the inspector, "along with a good company of others. You would be surprised if you knew how many wrecks there are on that pan of the coast. As a matter of fact, that is what takes me down there now. That is where the Otranto was wrecked 6 months ago." "I remember reading about it," I said. "No lives were lost, I think." "No lives were lost," said the inspector. "But something else was lost. It is not generally known, but the Otranto was carrying bullion." "Yes," I said, much interested. "Naturally, we have had divers at work on salvage operations, but the gold has gone, Mr. West." "Gone?" I said, staring at him. "How can it have gone?" "That is the question," said the inspector. "The rocks tore a gaping hole in her strong room. It was easy enough for the divers to get in that way, but they found the strong room empty. The question is, was the gold stolen before the wreck or afterwards? Was it ever in the strong room at all?" "It seems a curious case," I said. "It is a very curious case, when you consider what bullion is. Not a diamond necklace that you could put into your pocket. When you think how cumbersome it is and how bulky, well, the whole thing seems absolutely impossible. There may have been some hocus-pocus before the ship sailed, but if not, it must have been removed within the last 6 months, and I am going down to look into the matter." I found Newman waiting to meet me at the station. He apologized for the absence of his car, which had gone to Truro for some necessary repairs. Instead, he met me with a farm lorry belonging to the property. I swung myself up beside him, and we wound carefully in and out of the narrow streets of the fishing village. We went up a steep ascent, with a gradient, I should say, of 1 in 5, ran a little distance along a winding lane, and turned in at the granite-pillared gates of Pole House. The place was a charming one. It was situated high up the cliffs, with a good view out to sea. Part of it was some 300 or 400 years old, and a modern wing had been added. Behind it, farming land of about 7 or 8 acres ran inland. "Welcome to Pole House," said Newman, "and to the sign of the Golden Galleon," and he pointed to where, over the front door, hung a perfect reproduction of a Spanish galleon with all sails set. My first evening was a most charming and instructive one. My host showed me the old manuscripts relating to the Juan Fernandez. He unrolled charts for me and indicated positions on them with dotted lines, and he produced plans of diving apparatus, which, I may say, mystified me utterly and completely. I told him of my meeting with Inspector Badgeworth, in which he was much interested. "They are a queer people round this coast," he said reflectively. "Smuggling and wrecking is in their blood. When a ship goes down on their coast, they cannot help regarding it as lawful plunder meant for their pockets. There is a fellow here I should like you to see. He is an interesting survival." Next day dawned bright and clear. I was taken down into Polperron, and there introduced to Newman's diver, a man called Higgins. He was a wooden-faced individual, extremely taciturn, and his contributions to the conversation were mostly monosyllables. After a discussion between them on highly technical matters, we adjourned to the 3 Anchors. A tankard of beer somewhat loosened the worthy fellow's tongue. "Detective gentleman from London has come down," he grunted. "They do say that that ship that went down there last November was carrying a mortal lot of gold. Well, she wasn't the first to go down, and she won't be the last." "Hear, hear," chimed in the landlord of the 3 Anchors. "That is a true word you say there, Bill Higgins." "I reckon it is, Mr. Kelvin," said Higgins. I looked with some curiosity at the landlord. He was a remarkable-looking man, dark and swarthy, with curiously broad shoulders. His eyes were bloodshot, and he had a curiously furtive way of avoiding one's glance. I suspected that this was the man of whom Newman had spoken, saying he was an interesting survival. "We don't want interfering foreigners on this coast," he said, somewhat truculently. "Meaning the police?" asked Newman, smiling. "Meaning the police and others," said Kelvin significantly. "And don't you forget it, mister." "Do you know, Newman, that sounded to me very like a threat," I said as we climbed the hill. "Homewards." My friend laughed. "Nonsense. I don't do the folk down here any harm." I shook my head doubtfully. There was something sinister and uncivilized about Kelvin. I felt that his mind might run in strange, unrecognized channels. I think I date the beginning of my uneasiness from that moment. I had slept well enough that first night, but the next night my sleep was troubled and broken. Sunday dawned, dark and sullen, with an overcast sky and the threatenings of thunder in the air. I am always a bad hand at hiding my feelings, and Newman noticed the change in me. "What is the matter with you, West? You are a bundle of nerves this morning." "I don't know," I confessed, "but I have got a horrible feeling of foreboding." "It's the weather." "Yes, perhaps." I said no more. In the afternoon we went out in Newman's motorboat, but the rain came on with such vigour that we were glad to return to shore and change into dry clothing. And that evening my uneasiness increased. Outside the storm howled and roared. Towards 10 o'clock the tempest calmed down. Newman looked out of the window. "It is clearing," he said. "I shouldn't wonder if it was a perfectly fine night in another half-hour. If so, I shall go out for a stroll." I yawned. "I am frightfully sleepy," I said. "I didn't get much sleep last night. I think that tonight I shall turn in early." This I did. On the previous night I had slept little. Tonight I slept heavily, yet my slumbers were not restful. I was still oppressed with an awful foreboding of evil. I had terrible dreams. I dreamt of dreadful abysses and vast chasms, amongst which I was wandering, knowing that a slip of the foot meant death. I waked to find the hands of my clock pointing to 8 o'clock. My head was aching badly, and the terror of my night's dreams was still upon me. So strongly was this, so that when I went to the window and drew it up, I started back with a fresh feeling of terror, for the first thing I saw, or thought I saw, was a man digging an open grave. It took me a minute or two to pull myself together. Then I realized that the gravedigger was Newman's gardener, and the grave was destined to accommodate 3 new rose trees which were lying on the turf, waiting for the moment they should be securely planted in the earth. The gardener looked up and saw me and touched his hat. "Good morning, sir." "Nice morning, sir." "I suppose it is," I said doubtfully, still unable to shake off completely the depression of my spirits. However, as the gardener had said, it was certainly a nice morning. The sun was shining, and the sky a clear, pale blue that promised fine weather for the day. I went down to breakfast whistling a tune. Newman had no maids living in the house. 2 middle-aged sisters, who lived in a farmhouse nearby, came daily to attend to his simple wants. One of them was placing the coffee pot on the table as I entered the room. "Good morning, Elizabeth," I said. "Mr. Newman not down yet?" "He must have been out very early, sir," she replied. "He wasn't in the house when we arrived." Instantly my uneasiness returned. On the 2 previous mornings Newman had come down to breakfast somewhat late, and I didn't fancy that at any time he was an early riser. Moved by those forebodings, I ran up to his bedroom. It was empty, and, moreover, his bed had not been slept in. A brief examination of his room showed me 2 other things. If Newman had gone out for a stroll, he must have gone out in his evening clothes, for they were missing. I was sure now that my premonition of evil was justified. Newman had gone, as he had said he would do, for an evening stroll. For some reason or other, he had not returned. Why? Had he met with an accident? Fallen over the cliffs? A search must be made at once. In a few hours I had collected a large band of helpers, and together we hunted in every direction along the cliffs and on the rocks below. But there was no sign of Newman. In the end, in despair, I sought out Inspector Badgeworth. His face grew very grave. "It looks to me as if there has been foul play," he said. "There are some not over-scrupulous customers in these parts. Have you seen Kelvin, the landlord of the Three Anchors?" I said that I had seen him. "Did you know he did a turn in jail 4 years ago? Assault and battery." "It doesn't surprise me," I said. "The general opinion in this place seems to be that your friend is a bit too fond of nosing his way into things that do not concern him. I hope he has come to no serious harm." The search was continued with redoubled vigour. It was not until late that afternoon that our efforts were rewarded. We discovered Newman in a deep ditch in a corner of his own property. His hands and feet were securely fastened with rope, and a handkerchief had been thrust into his mouth and secured there so as to prevent him crying out. He was terribly exhausted and in great pain, but after some frictioning of his wrists and ankles and a long draught from a whisky flask, he was able to give his account of what had occurred. The weather having cleared, he had gone out for a stroll about 11 o'clock. His way had taken him some distance along the cliffs to a spot commonly known as Smuggler's Cove, owing to the large number of caves to be found there. Here he had noticed some men landing something from a small boat, and had strolled down to see what was going on. Whatever the stuff was, it seemed to be a great weight, and it was being carried into one of the farthermost caves. With no real suspicion of anything being amiss, nevertheless Newman had wondered. He had drawn quite near them without being observed. Suddenly there was a cry of alarm, and immediately 2 powerful seafaring men had set upon him and rendered him unconscious. When next he came to himself, he found himself lying on a motor vehicle of some kind, which was proceeding, with many bumps and bangs, as far as he could guess, up the lane which led from the coast to the village. To his great surprise, the lorry turned in at the gate of his own house. There, after a whispered conversation between the men, they at length drew him forth and flung him into a ditch at a spot where the depth of it rendered discovery unlikely for some time. Then the lorry drove on, and he thought, passed out through another gate some quarter of a mile nearer the village. He could give no description of his assailants except that they were certainly seafaring men and, by their speech, Cornishmen. Inspector Badgeworth was very interested. "Depend upon it, that is where the stuff has been hidden," he cried. "Somehow or other it has been salvaged from the wreck and has been stored in some lonely cave somewhere. It is known that we have searched all the caves in Smuggler's Cove, and that we are now going farther afield, and they have evidently been moving the stuff at night to a cave that has been already searched, and is not likely to be searched again. Unfortunately, they have had at least 18 hours to dispose of the stuff. If they got Mr. Newman last night, I doubt if we will find any of it by now." The inspector hurried off to make a search. He found definite evidence that the bullion had been stored as supposed, but the gold had been once more removed, and there was no clue as to its fresh hiding place. One clue there was, however, and the inspector himself pointed it out to me the following morning. "That lane is very little used by motor vehicles," he said, "and in 1 or 2 places we get the traces of the tyres very clearly. There is a 3-cornered piece out of one tyre, leaving a mark which is quite unmistakable. It shows going into the gate. Here and there is a faint mark of it going out of the other gate, so there is not much doubt that it is the right vehicle we are after. Now, why did they take it out through the farther gate? It seems quite clear to me that the lorry came from the village. Now, there aren't many people who own a lorry in the village, not more than 2 or 3 at most. Kelvin, the landlord of the Three Anchors, has one." "What was Kelvin's original profession?" asked Newman. "It is curious that you should ask me that, Mr. Newman. In his young days, Kelvin was a professional diver." Newman and I looked at each other. The puzzle seemed to be fitting itself together piece by piece. "You didn't recognize Kelvin as one of the men on the beach?" asked the inspector. Newman shook his head. "I am afraid I can't say anything as to that," he said regretfully. "I really hadn't time to see anything." The inspector very kindly allowed me to accompany him to the Three Anchors. The garage was up a side street. The big doors were closed, but by going up a little alley at the side. We found a small door that led into it, and the door was open. A very brief examination of the tyres sufficed for the inspector. "We have got him, by Jove!" he exclaimed. "Here is the mark as large as life on the rear left wheel. Now, Mr. Kelvin, I don't think you will be clever enough to wriggle out of this." Raymond West came to a halt. "Well?" said Joyce. "So far, I don't see anything to make a problem about, unless they never found the gold." "They never found the gold, certainly," said Raymond. "And they never got Kelvin either. I expect he was too clever for them, but I don't quite see how he worked it. He was duly arrested, on the evidence of the tire mark. But an extraordinary hitch arose. Just opposite the big doors of the garage was a cottage rented for the summer by a lady artist." "Oh, these lady artists," said Joyce, laughing. "As you say, oh, these lady artists." This particular one had been ill for some weeks, and in consequence had 2 hospital nurses attending her. The nurse, who was on night duty, had pulled her armchair up to the window, where the blind was up. She declared that the motor lorry could not have left the garage opposite without her seeing it, and she swore that in actual fact it never left the garage that night. "I don't think that is much of a problem," said Joyce. "The nurse went to sleep, of course. They always do." "That has, been known to happen," said Mr. Petherick judiciously, "but it seems to me that we are accepting facts without sufficient examination. Before accepting the testimony of the hospital nurse, we should inquire very closely into her bona fides. The alibi coming with such suspicious promptness is inclined to raise doubts in one's mind." "There is also the lady artist's testimony," said Raymond. "She declared that she was in pain and awake most of the night, and that she would certainly have heard the lorry, it being an unusual noise, and the night being very quiet after the storm." Said the clergyman. "That is certainly an additional fact. Had Kelvin himself any alibi?" "He declared that he was at home and in bed from 10 o'clock onwards, but he could produce no witnesses in support of that statement." "The nurse went to sleep," said Joyce, "and so did the patient. Ill people always think they have never slept a wink all night." Raymond West looked inquiringly at Dr. Pender. "Do you know, I feel very sorry for that man Kelvin. It seems to me very much a case of give a dog a bad name. Kelvin had been in prison. Apart from the tire mark, which certainly seems too remarkable to be coincidence, there doesn't seem to be much against him except his unfortunate record." "You, Sir Henry?" Sir Henry shook his head. "As it happens," he said, smiling, "I know something about this case, so clearly I mustn't speak. Well, go on, Aunt Jane. Haven't you got anything to say?" "In a minute, dear," said Miss Marple. "I am afraid I have counted wrong. 2 pearl, 3 plain, slip 1, 2 pearl. Yes, that's right. What did you say, dear? What is your opinion?" "You wouldn't like my opinion, dear. Young people never do, I notice. It is better to say nothing." "Nonsense, Aunt Jane. Out with it." "Well, dear Raymond," said Miss Marple, laying down her knitting and looking across at her nephew, "I do think you should be more careful how you choose your friends. You are so credulous, dear, so easily gulled. I suppose it is being a writer and having so much imagination. All that story about a Spanish galleon. If you were older and had more experience of life, you would have been on your guard at once. A man you had known only a few weeks, too." Sir Henry suddenly gave vent to a great roar of laughter and slapped his knee. "Got you this time, Raymond," he said. "Miss Marple, you are wonderful. Your friend Newman, my boy, has another name. Several other names, in fact. At the present moment he is not in Cornwall but in Devonshire, Dartmoor, to be exact, a convict in Princetown Prison. We didn't catch him over the stolen bullion business, but over the rifling of the strong room of one of the London banks. Then we looked up his past record, and we found a good portion of the gold stolen buried in the garden at Pole House. It was rather a neat idea. All along that Cornish coast there are stories of wrecked galleons full of gold. It accounted for the diver, and it would account later for the gold. But a scapegoat was needed, and Kelvin was ideal for the purpose. Newman played his little comedy very well, and our friend Raymond, with his celebrity as a writer, made an unimpeachable witness. "But the tire mark?" objected Joyce. "Oh, I saw that at once, dear, although I know nothing about motors," said Miss Marple. "People change a wheel, you know. I have often seen them doing it, and of course they could take a wheel off Kelvin's lorry and take it out through the small door into the alley and put it on to Mr. Newman's lorry, and take the lorry out of one gate down to the beach, fill it up with the gold, and bring it up through the other gate, and then they must have taken the wheel back and put it back on Mr. Kelvin's lorry while, I suppose, someone else was tying up Mr. Newman in a ditch. Very uncomfortable for him, and probably longer before he was found than he expected. I suppose the man who called himself the gardener attended to that side of the business. Why do you say, called himself the gardener, Aunt Jane? Asked Raymond curiously. Well, he can't have been a real gardener, can he? Said Miss Marple. Gardeners don't work on Whit Monday. Everybody knows that. She smiled and folded up her knitting. It was really that little fact that put me on the right scent, she said. She looked across at Raymond. When you are a householder, dear, and have a garden of your own, you will know these little things. Agatha Christie, The Double Clue. But above everything, no publicity, said Mr. Marcus Hardman for perhaps the 14th time. The word publicity occurred throughout his conversation with the regularity of a leitmotif. Mr. Hardman was a small man, delicately plump, with exquisitely manicured hands and a plaintive tenor voice. In his way, he was somewhat of a celebrity, and the fashionable life was his profession. He was rich, but not remarkably so, and he spent his money zealously in the pursuit of social pleasure. His hobby was collecting. He had the collector's soul. Old lace, old fans, antique jewellery, nothing crude or modern for Marcus Hardman. Poirot and I, obeying an urgent summons, had arrived to find the little man writhing in an agony of indecision. Under the circumstances, to call in the police was abhorrent to him. On the other hand, not to call them in was to acquiesce in the loss of some of the gems of his collection. He hit upon Poirot as a compromise. My rubies, Monsieur Poirot, and the emerald necklace said to have belonged to Catherine de Medici. Oh, the emerald necklace! If you will recount to me the circumstances of their disappearance, suggested Poirot gently. I am endeavouring to do so. Yesterday afternoon I had a little tea party, quite an informal affair, some 6 people or so. I have given 1 or 2 of them during the season, and though perhaps I should not say so, they have been quite a success. Some good music, Nakora, the pianist, and Catherine Bird, the Australian contralto, in the big studio. Well, early in the afternoon, I was showing my guests my collection of medieval jewels. I keep them in the small wall safe over there. It is arranged like a cabinet inside, with coloured velvet background to display the stones. Afterwards we inspected the fans, in the case on the wall. Then we all went to the studio, for music. It was not until after everyone had gone that I discovered the safe rifled. I must have failed to shut it properly, and someone had seized the opportunity to denude it of its contents. The rubies, Monsieur Poirot, the emerald necklace, the collection of a lifetime. What would I not give to recover them? But there must be no publicity. You fully understand that, do you not, Monsieur Poirot? My own guests, my personal friends. It would be a horrible scandal. Who was the last person to leave this room when you went to the studio? Mr. Johnston. You may know him, the South African millionaire. He has just rented the Abbotbury's house in Park Lane. He lingered behind a few moments, I remember. But surely it could not be he. Did any of your guests return to this room during the afternoon on any pretext? I was prepared for that question, Monsieur Poirot. 3 of them did so. Countess Vera Rossakoff, Mr. Bernard Parker, and Lady Runcorn. Let us hear about them. The Countess Rossakoff is a very charming Russian lady, a member of the old regime. She has recently come to this country. She had bade me goodbye, and I was therefore somewhat surprised to find her in this room apparently gazing in rapture at my cabinet of fans. You know, Monsieur Poirot, the more I think of it, the more suspicious it seems to me. Don't you agree? Extremely suspicious, but let us hear about the others. Well, Parker simply came here to fetch a case of miniatures that I was anxious to show to Lady Runcorn. And Lady Runcorn herself? As I dare say you know, Lady Runcorn is a middle-aged woman of considerable force of character, who devotes most of her time to various charitable committees. She simply returned to fetch a handbag she had laid down somewhere. Bien, monsieur. So we have 4 possible suspects: the Russian countess, the English grande dame, The South African millionaire and Mr. Bernard Parker. Who is Mr. Parker, by the way?" The question appeared to embarrass Mr. Hardman considerably. He is a young fellow. Well, in fact, a young fellow I know." "I had already deduced as much," replied Poirot gravely. "What does he do, this Mr. Parker?" "He is a young man about town, not perhaps quite in the swim, if I may so express myself." "How did he come to be a friend of yours, may I ask?" "Well, on one or two occasions he has performed certain little commissions for me." "Continue, monsieur," said Poirot. Hardman looked piteously at him. Evidently the last thing he wanted to do was to continue. But as Poirot maintained an inexorable silence, he capitulated. "You see, Monsieur Poirot, it is well known that I'm interested in antique jewels. Sometimes there is a family heirloom to be disposed of, which, mind you, would never be sold in the open market or to a dealer. But a private sale to me is a very different matter. Parker arranges the details of such things. He is in touch with both sides, and thus any little embarrassment is avoided. He brings anything of that kind to my notice. For instance, the Countess Rossakoff has brought some family jewels with her from Russia. She is anxious to sell them. Bernard Parker was to have arranged the transaction." "I see," said Poirot thoughtfully. "And you trust him implicitly?" "I have had no reason to do otherwise." "Mr. Hardman, of these 4 people, which do you yourself suspect?" "Oh, Monsieur Poirot, what a question. They are my friends, as I told you. I suspect none of them, or all of them, whichever way you like to put it." "I do not agree. You suspect one of those 4. It is not Countess Rossakoff. It is not Mr. Parker. Is it Lady Runcorn or Mr. Johnston?" "You drive me into a corner, Monsieur Poirot. You do indeed. I am most anxious to have no scandal. Lady Runcorn belongs to one of the oldest families in England. But it is true, it is most unfortunately true, that her aunt, Lady Caroline, suffered from a most melancholy affliction. It was understood, of course, by all her friends, and her maid returned the teaspoons, or whatever it was, as promptly as possible. You see my predicament. So Lady Runcorn had an aunt who was a kleptomaniac. Very interesting. You permit that I examine the safe?" Mr. Hardman assenting, Poirot pushed back the door of the safe and examined the interior. The empty velvet-lined shelves gaped at us. "Even now the door does not shut properly," murmured Poirot as he swung it to and fro. "I wonder why. Ah, what have we here? A glove, caught in the hinge. A man's glove." He held it out to Mr. Hardman. "That's not one of my gloves," the latter declared. "Aha! Something more." Poirot bent deftly and picked up a small object from the floor of the safe. It was a flat cigarette case made of black moiré. "My cigarette case?" cried Mr. Hardman. "Yours? Surely not, monsieur. Those are not your initials." He pointed to an entwined monogram of 2 letters executed in platinum. Hardman took it in his hand. "You are right," he declared. "It is very like mine, but the initials are different. A B and a P. Good heavens! Parker." "It would seem so," said Poirot. "A somewhat careless young man, especially if the glove is his also. That would be a double clue, would it not?" "Bernard Parker," murmured Hardman. "What a relief! Well, Monsieur Poirot, I leave it to you to recover the jewels. Place the matter in the hands of the police if you think fit. That is, if you are quite sure that it is he who is guilty." "See you, my friend," said Poirot to me as we left the house together. "He has one law for the titled, and another law for the plain, this Mr. Hardman. Me, I have not yet been ennobled, so I am on the side of the plain. I have sympathy for this young man. The whole thing was a little curious, was it not? There was Hardman suspecting Lady Runcorn. There was I, suspecting the Countess and Johnston, and all the time the obscure Mr. Parker was our man." "Why did you suspect the other 2? "Parbleu, it is such a simple thing to be a Russian refugee or a South African millionaire. Any woman can call herself a Russian countess. Anyone can buy a house in Park Lane and call himself a South African millionaire. Who is going to contradict them? But I observe that we are passing through Berry Street. Our careless young friend lives here. Let us, as you say, strike while the iron is in the fire." Mr. Bernard Parker was at home. We found him reclining on some cushions, clad in an amazing dressing gown of purple and orange. I have seldom taken a greater dislike to anyone than I did to this particular young man with his white, effeminate face and affected, lisping speech. "Good morning, monsieur," said Poirot briskly. "I come from Mr. Hardman. Yesterday, at the party, somebody has stolen all his jewels. Permit me to ask you, monsieur, is this your glove?" Mr. Parker's mental processes did not seem very rapid. He stared at the glove as though gathering his wits together. "Where did you find it?" he asked it at last. "Is it your glove, monsieur?" Mr. Parker appeared to make up his mind. "No, it isn't," he declared. "And this cigarette case, is that yours?" "Certainly not. I always carry a silver one." "Very well, monsieur. I go to put matters in the hands of the police." "Oh, I say, I wouldn't do that if I were you," cried Mr. Parker in some concern. "Beastly unsympathetic people. The police. Wait a bit. I'll go round and see old Hardman. Look here. Oh, stop a minute." But Poirot beat a determined retreat. "So, we have given him something to think about, have we not?" he chuckled. "Tomorrow we will observe what has occurred." But we were destined to have a reminder of the Hardman case that afternoon. Without the least warning, the door flew open, and a whirlwind in human form invaded our privacy, bringing with her a swirl of sables. It was as cold as only an English June day can be, and a hat rampant with slaughtered ospreys. Countess Vera Rossakoff was a somewhat disturbing personality. "You are Monsieur Poirot? What is this that you have done? You accuse that poor boy. It is infamous. It is scandalous. I know him. He is a chicken, a lamb. Never would he steal. He has done everything for me. Will I stand by and see him martyred and butchered? Tell me, madame, is this his cigarette case?" Poirot held out the black moiré case. The Countess paused for a moment while she inspected it. "Yes, it is his. I know it well. What of it? Did you find it in the room? We were all there. He dropped it then, I suppose. Ah, you policemen, you are worse than the Red Guards. And is this his glove?" "How should I know? One glove is like another. Do not try to stop me. He must be set free. His character must be cleared. You shall do it. I will sell my jewels and give you much money." "Madame, it is agreed then? No, do not argue. The poor boy, he came to me, the tears in his eyes. 'I will save you,' I said. 'I will go to this man, this ogre, this monster. Leave it to Vera.' Now it is settled, I go." With as little ceremony as she had come, she swept from the room, leaving an overpowering perfume of an exotic nature behind her. "What a woman!" I exclaimed. "And what furs!" "Ah, yes, they were genuine enough. Could a spurious countess have real furs? My little joke, Hastings, no, she is truly Russian, I fancy. Well, so Master Bernard went bleating to her. The cigarette case is his. I wonder if the glove is also—" With a smile, Poirot drew from his pocket a second glove and placed it by the first. There was no doubt of there being a pair. "Where did you get the second one, Poirot?" "It was thrown down with a stick on the table in the hall in Berry Street. Truly a very careless young man, Monsieur Parker. Well, mon ami, we must be thorough. Just for the form of the thing, I will make a little visit to Park Lane." Needless to say, I accompanied my friend. Johnston was out, but we saw his private secretary. It transpired that Johnston had only recently arrived from South Africa. He had never been in England before. "He is interested in precious stones, is he not?" hazarded Poirot. "Gold mining is nearer the mark," laughed the secretary. Poirot came away from the interview thoughtful. Late that evening, to my utter surprise, I found him earnestly studying a Russian grammar. "Good heavens, Poirot," I cried, "are you learning Russian in order to converse with the Countess in her own language?" "She certainly would not listen to my English, my friend." "But surely, Poirot, well-born Russians invariably speak French." "You are a mine of information, Hastings. I will cease puzzling over the intricacies of the Russian alphabet." He threw the book from him with a dramatic gesture. I was not entirely satisfied. There was a twinkle in his eye which I knew of old. It was an invariable sign that Hercule Poirot was pleased with himself. "Perhaps," I said sapiently, "you doubt her being really a Russian. You are going to test her." "Ah, no, she is Russian all right." "Well then, if you really want to distinguish yourself over this case, Hastings, I recommend first steps in Russian as an invaluable aid." Then he laughed and would say no more. I picked up the book from the floor and dipped into it curiously, but could make neither head nor tail of Poirot's remarks. The following morning brought us no news of any kind, but that did not seem to worry my little friend. At breakfast, he announced his intention of calling upon Mr. Hardman early in the day. We found the elderly social butterfly at home, and seemingly a little calmer than on the previous day. "Well, Monsieur Poirot, any news?" he demanded eagerly. Poirot handed him a slip of paper. "That is the person who took the jewels, monsieur. Shall I put matters in the hands of the police? Or would you prefer me to recover the jewels without bringing the police into the matter?" Mr. Hardman was staring at the paper. At last he found his voice. "Most astonishing. I should infinitely prefer to have no scandal in the matter. I give you carte blanche, Monsieur Poirot. I am sure you will be discreet." Our next procedure was to hail a taxi, which Poirot ordered to drive to the Carlton. There he inquired for Countess Rossakoff. In a few minutes we were ushered up into the ladies' suite. She came to meet us with outstretched hands, arrayed in a marvellous negligée of barbaric design. "Monsieur Poirot," she cried, "you have succeeded. You have cleared that poor infant." "Madame la Comtesse, your friend Mr. Parker is perfectly safe from arrest." "Ah, but you are the clever little man. Superb. And so quickly, too." "On the other hand, I have promised Mr. Hardman that the jewels shall be returned to him today." "So? Therefore, madame, I should be extremely obliged if you would place them in my hands without delay. I am sorry to hurry you, but I am keeping a taxi in case it should be necessary for me to go on to Scotland Yard, and we Belgians, madame, we practice the thrift." The Countess had lighted a cigarette. For some seconds she sat perfectly still, blowing smoke rings and gazing steadily at Poirot. Then she burst into a laugh and rose. She went across to the bureau, opened a drawer, and took out a black silk handbag. She tossed it lightly to Poirot. Her tone, when she spoke, was perfectly light and unmoved. "We Russians, on the contrary, practice prodigality," she said. "And to do that, unfortunately, one must have money. You need not look inside. They are all there." Poirot arose. "I congratulate you, madame, on your quick intelligence and your promptitude." "Ah, but since you were keeping your taxi waiting, what else could I do?" "You are too amiable, madame. You are remaining long in London?" "I am afraid no. Owing to you." "Accept my apologies." "We shall meet again elsewhere, perhaps." "I hope so." "And I do not," exclaimed the Countess with a laugh. "It is a great compliment that I pay you there. There are very few men in the world whom I fear. Goodbye, Monsieur Poirot." "Goodbye, Madame la Comtesse. Ah, pardon me, I forgot. Allow me to return you your cigarette case." And with a bow he handed to her the little black moire case we had found in the safe. She accepted it without any change of expression, just a lifted eyebrow and a murmured, "I see." "What a woman!" cried Poirot enthusiastically as we descended the stairs. "Mon Dieu, quelle femme! Not a word of argument, of protestation, of bluff. One quick glance, and she had sized up the position correctly. I tell you, Hastings, a woman who can accept defeat like that with a careless smile will go far. She is dangerous. She has the nerves of steel. He tripped heavily. "If you can manage to moderate your transports and look where you're going, it might be as well," I suggested. "When did you first suspect the Countess?" "Mon ami. It was the glove and the cigarette case, the double clue, shall we say, that worried me. Bernard Parker might easily have dropped one or the other, but hardly both. Ah, no, that would have been too careless. In the same way, if someone else had placed them there to incriminate Parker, one would have been sufficient. The cigarette case or the glove, again not both. So I was forced to the conclusion that one of the two things did not belong to Parker. I imagined at first that the case was his, and that the glove was not. But when I discovered the fellow to the glove, I saw that it was the other way about. Whose, then, was the cigarette case? Clearly, it could not belong to Lady Runcorn. The initials were wrong. Mr. Johnston? Only if he were here under a false name. I interviewed his secretary, and it was apparent at once that everything was clear and above board. There was no reticence about Mr. Johnston's past. The Countess, then? She was supposed to have brought jewels with her from Russia. She had only to take the stones from their settings, and it was extremely doubtful if they could ever be identified. What could be easier for her than to pick up one of Parker's gloves from the hall that day and thrust it into the safe? But, bien sûr, she did not intend to drop her own cigarette case. But if the case was hers, why did it have BP on it? The Countess's initials are VR. Poirot smiled gently upon me. Exactly, mon ami, but in the Russian alphabet, B is V and P is R. Well, you couldn't expect me to guess that. I don't know Russian. Neither do I, Hastings. That is why I bought my little book and urged it on your attention. He sighed. A remarkable woman. I have a feeling, my friend, a very decided feeling I shall meet her again. Where, I wonder? Agatha Christie, The Submarine Plans. A note had been brought by special messenger. Poirot read it, and a gleam of excitement and interest came into his eyes as he did so. He dismissed the man with a few curt words, and then turned to me. "Pack a bag with all haste, my friend. We're going down to Sharples." I started at the mention of the famous country place of Lord Alloway. Head of the newly formed Ministry of Defence, Lord Alloway was a prominent member of the Cabinet. As Sir Ralph Curtis, head of a great engineering firm, he had made his mark in the House of Commons, and he was now freely spoken of as the coming man, and the one most likely to be asked to form a ministry should the rumours as to Mr. David McAdam's health prove well-founded. A big Rolls-Royce car was waiting for us below, and as we glided off into the darkness, I plied Poirot with questions. "What on earth can they want us for at this time of night?" I demanded. It was past 11. Poirot shook his head. "Something of the most urgent, without doubt." "I remember," I said, "that some years ago there was some rather ugly scandal about Ralph Curtis, as he then was. Some jugglery with shares, I believe. In the end he was completely exonerated, but perhaps something of the kind has arisen again." "It would hardly be necessary for him to send for me in the middle of the night, my friend." I was forced to agree, and the remainder of the journey was passed in silence. Once out of London, the powerful car forged rapidly ahead, and we arrived at Sharples in a little under the hour. A pontifical butler conducted us at once to a small study where Lord Alloway was awaiting us. He sprang up to greet us, a tall, spare man who seemed actually to radiate power and vitality. "Monsieur Poirot, I am delighted to see you. It is the second time the government has demanded your services. I remember only too well what you did for us during the war, when the Prime Minister was kidnapped in that astounding fashion. Your masterly deductions, and may I add, your discretion, saved the situation." Poirot's eyes twinkled a little. "Do I gather, then, Miller, that this is another case for discretion?" "Most emphatically. Sir Harry and I— Oh, let me introduce you. Admiral Sir Harry Weardale, our first Sea Lord, Monsieur Poirot, and let me see, Captain." "Hastings," I supplied. "I've often heard of you, Monsieur Poirot," said Sir Harry, shaking hands. "This is a most unaccountable business, and if you can solve it, we'll be extremely grateful to you." I liked the First Sea Lord immediately, a square, bluff sailor of the good old-fashioned type. Poirot looked inquiringly at them both, and Alloway took up the tale. "Of course you understand that all this is in confidence, Monsieur Poirot. We have had a most serious loss. The plans of the new Z type of submarine have been stolen." When was that? Tonight, less than 3 hours ago. You can appreciate, perhaps, Monsieur Poirot, the magnitude of the disaster. It is essential that the loss should not be made public. I will give you the facts as briefly as possible. My guests over the weekend were the Admiral, here, his wife and son, and Mrs. Conrad, a lady well known in London society. The ladies retired to bed early, about 10 o'clock. So did Mr. Leonard Weardale. Sir Harry is down here partly for the purpose of discussing the construction of this new type of submarine with me. Accordingly, I asked Mr. Fitzroy, my secretary, to get out the plans from the safe in the corner there, and to arrange them ready for me, as well as various other documents that bore upon the subject in hand. While he was doing this, the Admiral and I strolled up and down the terrace, smoking cigars and enjoying the warm June air. We finished our smoke and our chat and decided to get down to business. Just as we turned at the far end of the terrace, I fancied I saw a shadow slip out of the French window here, cross the terrace, and disappear. I paid very little attention, however. I knew Fitzroy to be in this room, and it never entered my head that anything might be amiss. There, of course, I am to blame. Well, we retraced our steps along the terrace and entered this room by the window, just as Fitzroy entered it from the hall. "Got everything out we are likely to need, Fitzroy?" I asked. "I think so, Lord Alloway. The papers are all on your desk," he answered, and then he wished us both good night. "Just wait a minute," I said, going to the desk. "I may want something I haven't mentioned." I looked quickly through the papers that were lying there. "You've forgotten the most important of the lot, Fitzroy," I said. "The actual plans of the submarine." "The plans are right on top, Lord Alloway." "Oh, no, they're not," I said, turning over the papers. "But I put them there not a minute ago." "Well, they're not here now," I said. Fitzroy advanced with a bewildered expression on his face. The thing seemed incredible. We turned over the papers on the desk. We hunted through the safe. But at last we had to make up our minds to it that the papers were gone, and gone within the short space of about 3 minutes, while Fitzroy was absent from the room. "Why did he leave the room?" asked Poirot quickly. "Just what I asked him!" exclaimed Sir Harry. "It appears," said Lord Alloway, "that just when he had finished arranging the papers on my desk, he was startled by hearing a woman scream. He dashed out into the hall. On the stairs he discovered Mrs. Conrad's French maid. The girl looked very white and upset, and declared that she had seen a ghost, a tall figure dressed all in white that moved without a sound. Fitzroy laughed at her fears and told her, in more or less polite language, not to be a fool. Then he returned to this room just as we entered from the window. "It all seems very clear," said Poirot thoughtfully. "The only question is, was the maid an accomplice? Did she scream by arrangement with her confederate lurking outside, or was he merely waiting there in the hope of an opportunity presenting itself? It was a man, I suppose, not a woman you saw?" "I can't tell you, Monsieur Poirot. It was just a shadow." The Admiral gave such a peculiar snort that it could not fail to attract attention. "Monsieur l'Amiral has something to say, I think," said Poirot quietly, with a slight smile. "You saw this shadow, Sir Harry?" "No, I didn't," returned the other, "and neither did Alloway. The branch of a tree flapped or something, and then afterwards, when we discovered the theft, he leapt to the conclusion that he had seen someone pass across the terrace. His imagination played a trick on him, that's all." "I am not usually credited with having much imagination," said Lord Alloway with a slight smile. "Nonsense, we've all got imagination. We can all work ourselves up to believe that we've seen more than we have. I've had a lifetime of experience at sea, and I'll back my eyes against those of any landsman. I was looking right down the terrace, and I'd have seen the same if there was anything to see." He was quite excited over the matter. Poirot rose and stepped quickly to the window. "You permit?" he asked. "We must settle this point if possible." He went out upon the terrace, and we followed him. He had taken an electric torch from his pocket and was playing the light along the edge of the grass that bordered the terrace. "Where did he cross the terrace, Miller?" he asked. "About opposite the window, I should say." Poirot continued to play the torch for some minutes longer, walking the entire length of the terrace and back. Then he shut it off and straightened himself up. "Sir Harry is right, and you are wrong, Myler," he said quietly. "It rained heavily earlier this evening. Anyone who passed over that grass could not avoid leaving footmarks. But there are none. None at all." His eyes went from one man's face to the other's. Lord Alloway looked bewildered and unconvinced. The Admiral expressed a noisy gratification. "Knew I couldn't be wrong," he declared. "Trust my eyes anywhere." He was such a picture of an honest old sea dog that I could not help smiling. "So that brings us to the people in the house," said Poirot smoothly. "Let us come inside again. Now, milor, while Mr. Fitzroy was speaking to the maid on the stairs, could anyone have seized the opportunity to enter the study from the hall?" Lord Alloway shook his head. "Quite impossible. They would have had to pass him in order to do so." "And Mr. Fitzroy himself. You are sure of him, eh?" Lord Alloway flushed. "Absolutely, Monsieur Poirot. I will answer confidently for my secretary. It is quite impossible that he should be concerned in the matter in any way." "Everything seems to be impossible," remarked Poirot rather dryly. "Possibly the plans attached to themselves a little pair of wings and flew away, comme ça." He blew his lips out like a comical cherub. "The whole thing is impossible," declared Lord Alloway impatiently. "But I beg, Monsieur Poirot, that you will not dream of suspecting Fitzroy. Consider for one moment, had he wished to take the plans, what could have been easier for him than to take a tracing of them without going to the trouble of stealing them?" "There, milor," said Poirot with approval. "You make a remark bien juste. I see that you have a mind orderly and methodical. L'Angleterre is happy in possessing you." Lord Alloway looked rather embarrassed by this sudden burst of praise. Poirot returned to the matter in hand. "The room in which you had been sitting all the evening—" "The drawing-room, yes?" "That also has a window on the terrace, since I remember your saying you went out that way. Would it not be possible for someone to come out by the drawing-room window and in by this one while Mr. Fitzroy was out of the room, and return the same way?" "But we'd have seen them," objected the Admiral. "Not if you had your backs turned, walking the other way." "Fitzroy was only out of the room a few minutes, the time it would take us to walk to the end and back." "No matter. It is a possibility, in fact, the only one as things stand." "But there was no one in the drawing-room when we went out," said the Admiral. "They may have come there afterwards." "You mean," said Lord Alloway slowly, "that when Fitzroy heard the maid scream and went out, someone was already concealed in the drawing-room, and that they darted in and out through the windows, and only left the drawing-room when Fitzroy had returned to this room." "The methodical mind again," said Poirot, bowing. "You express the matter perfectly. One of the servants, perhaps. Or a guest. It was Mrs. Conrad's maid who screamed. What exactly can you tell me of Mrs. Conrad?" Lord Alloway considered for a minute. "I told you that she is a lady well known in society. That is true in the sense that she gives large parties and goes everywhere. But very little is known as to where she really comes from and what her past life has been. She is a lady who frequents diplomatic and foreign office circles as much as possible. The Secret Service is inclined to ask, why?" "I see," said Poirot. "And she was asked here this weekend. So that, shall we say, we might observe her at close quarters?" "Parfaitement. It is possible that she has turned the tables on you rather neatly." Lord Alloway looked discomfited, and Poirot continued, "Tell me, Myler, was any reference made in her hearing to the subjects you and the Admiral were going to discuss together?" "Yes," admitted the other. "Sir Harry said, 'And now for our submarine. To work,' or something of that sort. The others had left the room, but she had come back for a book." "I see," said Poirot thoughtfully. "Milor, it is very late, but this is an urgent affair. I would like to question the members of this house party at once, if it is possible." "It can be managed, of course," said Lord Alloway. "The awkward thing is, we don't want to let it get about more than can be helped. Of course Lady Juliet Weardale and young Leonard are all right, but Mrs. Conrad, if she is not guilty, is rather a different proposition. Perhaps you could just state that an important paper is missing without specifying what it is, or going into any of the circumstances of the disappearance. "Exactly what I was about to propose myself," said Poirot, beaming. "In fact, in all three cases. Monsieur the Admiral will pardon me, but even the best of wives—" "No offence," said Sir Harry. "All women talk, bless 'em. I wish Juliet would talk a little more and play bridge a little less, but women are like that nowadays, never happy unless they're dancing or gambling. I'll get Juliet and Leonard up, shall I, Alloway?" "Thank you. I'll call the French maid. Monsieur Poirot will want to see her, and she can rouse her mistress. I'll attend to it now. In the meantime, I'll send Fitzroy along." Mr. Fitzroy was a pale, thin young man with pince-nez and a frigid expression. His statement was practically word for word what Lord Alloway had already told us. "What is your own theory, Mr. Fitzroy?" Mr. Fitzroy shrugged his shoulders. Undoubtedly someone who knew the hang of things was waiting his chance outside. He could see what went on through the window, and he slipped in when I left the room. It's a pity Lord Alloway didn't give chase then and there when he saw the fellow leave." Poirot did not undeceive him. Instead he asked, "Do you believe the story of the French maid, that she had seen a ghost?" "Well, hardly, Monsieur Poirot. I mean that she really thought so." "Oh, as to that, I can't say. She certainly seemed rather upset. She had her hands to her head." "Aha!" cried Poirot with the air of one who has made a discovery. "Is that so indeed? And she was without doubt a pretty girl?" "I didn't notice particularly," said Mr. Fitzroy in a repressive voice. "You did not see her mistress, I suppose?" "As a matter of fact, I did. She was in the gallery at the top of the steps and was calling her Léonie. Then she saw me, and of course retired." "Upstairs?" said Poirot, frowning. "Yes. Of course I realise that all this is very unpleasant for me. Or rather would have been if Lord Alloway had not chanced to see the man actually leaving. In any case, I should be glad if you would make a point of searching my room, and myself." "You really wish that?" "Certainly I do." What Poirot would have replied I do not know, but at that moment Lord Alloway reappeared and informed us that the two ladies and Mr. Leonard Weardale were in the drawing-room. The women were in becoming negligées. Mrs. Conrad was a beautiful woman of 35, with golden hair and a slight tendency to embonpoint. Lady Juliet Weardale must have been 40, tall and dark, very thin, still beautiful, with exquisite hands and feet, and a restless, haggard manner. Her son was rather an effeminate-looking young man, as great a contrast to his bluff, hearty father as could well be imagined. Poirot gave forth the little rigmarole we had agreed upon, and then explained that he was anxious to know if anyone had heard or seen anything that night which might assist us. Turning to Mrs. Conrad first, he asked her if she would be so kind as to inform him exactly what her movements had been. "Let me see. I went upstairs. I rang for my maid. Then, as she did not put in an appearance, I came out and called her. I could hear her talking on the stairs. After she had brushed my hair, I sent her away. She was in a very curious nervous state. I read a while and then went to bed." "And you, Lady Juliet?" "I went straight upstairs and to bed. I was very tired." "What about your book, dear?" asked Mrs. Conrad with a sweet smile. "My book?" Lady Juliet flushed. "Yes, you know, when I sent Léonie away, you were coming up the stairs. You had been down to the drawing-room for a book, you said." "Oh, yes. I did go down. I forgot." Lady Juliet clasped her hands nervously together. "Did you hear Mrs. Conrad's maid scream, milady?" No, I didn't." "How curious, because you must have been in the drawing-room at the time." "I heard nothing," said Lady Juliet in a firmer voice. Poirot turned to young Leonard. "Monsieur?" "Nothing doing. I went straight upstairs and turned in." Poirot stroked his chin. "Alas, I fear there is nothing to help me here. Mesdames and Monsieur, I regret infinitely to have deranged you from your slumbers for so little. Accept my apologies, I pray of you." Gesticulating and apologizing, he marshalled them out. He returned with the French maid, a pretty, impudent-looking girl. Alloway and Weardale had gone out with the ladies. "Now, mademoiselle," said Poirot in a brisk tone, "let us have the truth. Recount to me no histories. Why did you scream on the stairs? Ah, monsieur, I saw a tall figure all in white. Poirot arrested her with an energetic shake of his forefinger. Did I not say, recount to me no histories? I will make a guess. He kissed you, did he not? Monsieur Leonard Weardale, I mean. Eh bien, monsieur, and after all, what is a kiss? Under the circumstances, it is most natural, replied Poirot gallantly. I myself, or Hastings here, but tell me just what occurred. He came up behind me and caught me. I was startled, and I screamed. If I had known, I would not have screamed, but he came upon me like a cat. Then came Monsieur le Secrétaire. Monsieur Leonard flew up the stairs. And what could I say? Especially to a jeune homme comme ça, tellement comme il faut. Ma foi, I invent a ghost. And all is explained, cried Poirot genially. You then mounted to the chamber of Madame your mistress. Which is her room, by the way? It is at the end, monsieur. That way. Directly over the study, then. Bien, mademoiselle, I will detain you no longer, and la prochaine fois, do not scream. Handing her out, he came back to me with a smile. An interesting case, is it not, Hastings? I begin to have a few little ideas. Et vous? What was Leonard Weardale doing on the stairs? I don't like that young man, Poirot. He's a thorough young rake, I should say. I agree with you, mon ami. Fitzroy seems an honest fellow. Lord Alloway is certainly insistent on that point. And yet there is something in his manner. That is almost too good to be true. I felt it myself. On the other hand, our friend Mrs. Conrad is certainly no good at all. And her room is over the study, I said musingly, and keeping a sharp eye on Poirot. He shook his head with a slight smile. No, mon ami, I cannot bring myself seriously to believe that immaculate lady swarmed down the chimney, or let herself down from the balcony. As he spoke, the door opened, and to my great surprise, Lady Juliet Weardale flitted in. Monsieur Poirot, she said somewhat breathlessly, can I speak to you alone? Milady, Captain Hastings is as my other self. You can speak before him as though he were a thing of no account, not there at all. Be seated, I pray you. She sat down, still keeping her eyes fixed on Poirot. What I have to say is rather difficult. You are in charge of this case. If the papers were to be returned, would that end the matter? I mean, could it be done without questions being asked? Poirot stared hard at her. Let me understand you, madame. They are to be placed in my hand, is that right? And I am to return them to Lord Alloway on the condition that he asks no questions as to where I got them. She bowed her head. That is what I mean. But I must be sure there will be no publicity. I do not think Lord Alloway is particularly anxious for publicity, said Poirot grimly. You accept, then? She cried eagerly in response. A little moment, milady. It depends on how soon you can place those papers in my hands. Almost immediately. Poirot glanced up at the clock. How soon, exactly? Say 10 minutes, she whispered. I accept, milady. She hurried from the room. I pursed my mouth up for a whistle. Can you sum up the situation for me, Hastings? Bridge? I replied succinctly. Ah, you remember the careless words of Monsieur the Admiral. What a memory. I felicitate you, Hastings. We said no more, for Lord Alloway came in, and looked inquiringly at Poirot. Have you any further ideas, Monsieur Poirot? I am afraid the answers to your questions have been rather disappointing. Not at all, Miller. They have been quite sufficiently illuminating. It will be unnecessary for me to stay here any longer, and so, with your permission, I will return at once to London. Lord Alloway seemed dumbfounded. But what have you discovered? Do you know who took the plans? Yes, milord, I do. Tell me, in the case of the papers being returned to you anonymously, you would prosecute no further inquiry. Lord Alloway stared at him. Do you mean on payment of a sum of money? No, Miller, returned unconditionally. And, of course, the recovery of the plans is the great thing, said Lord Alloway slowly. He looked puzzled and uncomprehending. Then I should seriously recommend you to adopt that course. Only you, the Admiral, and your secretary know of the loss. Only they need know of the restitution, and you may count on me to support you in every way, lay the mystery on my shoulders. You asked me to restore the papers. I have done so. You know no more." He rose and held out his hand. "My lord, I am glad to have met you. I have faith in you, and your devotion to England. You will guide her destinies with a strong, sure hand. Monsieur Poirot, I swear to you that I will do my best. It may be a fault, or it may be a virtue, but I believe in myself." "So does every great man. Me, I am the same," said Poirot grandiloquently. The car came round to the door in a few minutes, and Lord Alloway bade us farewell on the steps with renewed cordiality. "That is a great man, Hastings," said Poirot as we drove off. "He has brains, resource, power. He is the strong man that England needs to guide her through these difficult days of reconstruction." "I'm quite ready to agree with all you say, Poirot. But what about Lady Juliet? Is she to return the papers straight to Alloway? What will she think when she finds you have gone off without a word? Hastings, I will ask you a little question. Why, when she was talking with me, did she not hand me the plans then and there?" "She hadn't got them with her." "Perfectly. How long would it take her to fetch them from her room, or from any hiding place in the house?" "You need not answer, I will tell you. Probably about 2 minutes and a half. Yet she asks for 10 minutes. Why? Clearly she has to obtain them from some other person, and to reason or argue with that person before they give them up. Now, what person could that be? Not Mrs. Conrad, clearly, but a member of her own family, her husband or son. Which is it likely to be? Leonard Weardale said he went straight to bed. We know that to be untrue. Supposing his mother went to his room and found it empty. Supposing she came down filled with a nameless dread. He is no beauty, that son of hers. She does not find him, but later she hears him deny that he ever left his room. She leaps to the conclusion that he is the thief. Hence her interview with me. But, mon ami, we know something that Lady Juliet does not. We know that her son could not have been in the study because he was on the stairs making love to the pretty French maid. Although she does not know it, Leonard Weardale has an alibi. Well then, who did steal the papers? We seem to have eliminated everybody. Lady Juliet, her son, Mrs. Conrad, the French maid. Exactly. Use your little grey cells, my friend. The solution stares you in the face. I shook my head blankly. But yes, if you would only persevere. See then, Fitzroy goes out of the study. He leaves the papers on the desk. A few minutes later, Lord Alloway enters the room, goes to the desk, and the papers are gone. Only two things are possible. Either Fitzroy did not leave the papers on the desk, but put them in his pocket, and that is not reasonable because, as Alloway pointed out, he could have taken a tracing at his own convenience any time, or else the papers were still on the desk when Lord Alloway went to it, in which case they went into his pocket. Lord Alloway the thief, I said, dumbfounded. But why? Why? Did you not tell me of some scandal in the past? He was exonerated, you said. But suppose, after all, it had been true. In English public life there must be no scandal. If this were raked up and proved against him now, goodbye to his political career. We will suppose that he was being blackmailed, and the price asked was the submarine plans. But the man's a black traitor, I cried. Oh, no, he is not. He is clever and resourceful. Supposing, my friend, that he copied those plans, making, for he is a clever engineer, a slight alteration in each part which will render them quite impracticable. He hands the faked plans to the enemy's agent, Mrs. Conrad, I fancy, but in order that no suspicion of their genuineness may arise, the plans must seem to be stolen. He does his best to throw no suspicion on anyone in the house by pretending to see a man leaving the window. But there he ran up against the obstinacy of the Admiral. So his next anxiety is that no suspicion shall fall on Fitzroy. This is all guesswork on your part, Poirot, I objected. It is psychology, mon ami. A man who had handed over the real plans would not be over-scrupulous as to who was likely to fall under suspicion. And why was he so anxious that no details of the robbery should be given to Mrs. Conrad? Because he had handed over the faked plans earlier in the evening and did not want her to know that the theft could only have taken place later. "I wonder if you are right," I said. "Of course I am right. I spoke to Alloway as one great man to another, and he understood perfectly. You will see." One thing is quite certain. On the day when Lord Alloway became Prime Minister, a cheque and a signed photograph arrived. On the photograph were the words, "To my discreet friend, Hercule Poirot, from Alloway." I believe that the Z type of submarine is causing great exultation in naval circles. They say it will revolutionize modern naval warfare. I have heard that a certain foreign power essayed to construct something of the same kind, and the result was a dismal failure, but I still consider that Poirot was guessing. He will do it once too often one of these days.